The COVID-19 pandemic has amplified challenges that plagued healthcare, including a vulnerable supply chain system. As orthopedics enters a new normal, surgeons and device companies will need to work together to create a more resilient supply chain. This is Carolyn Lowell with OrthoWorld. To answer questions learned from COVID-19 thus far and to discuss how to bring greater automation to the supply chain and the operating room, I spoke with Dr. Vinod Dasa. Dr. Dasa serves as Vice Chair of Academic Affairs in the Orthopedic Department at LSU and Chief Medical Officer of Site Medical. We started our conversation talking about his experience with elective procedure postponement.
So unfortunately, my experience over the last month has been very quiet. And I think a lot of the surgeons are trying to figure out, how to best manage our patients right now, because I'll be honest with you, a lot of them are struggling, especially the ones that were scheduled for surgery. And obviously now they're having no treatment. And we're trying to the best we can, manage them via telemedicine. We have a trickle of patients coming in for injections or something to try to alleviate their symptoms in the short term. And so I think in terms of patient safety and health, it's been a challenge. We've never really had anything like this where we can't tell patients, I can help you, where it's an unusual feeling to tell a patient I can't help them because the system isn't letting me, as opposed to it's some complex disease that we don't have an answer for. So it's extremely frustrating and difficult, I think, for physicians to not be able to help our patients when we know we have the ability and skills to do it. So it's a very awkward feeling and situation right now. So for that immediate impact right now in terms of the safety and health of our patients, I think that's the issue. And then moving forward, after social distancing gets reduced and we kind of start seeing the light at the end of this tunnel, I think a lot of surgeons and a lot of facilities now are trying to figure out what the best path forward is. We're starting to hear some things out of Germany about slowly scaling up different industries and different aspects of the economy. So you strike a balance between population health and keeping the virus at a low level, but at the same time getting key functions of the economy and the system up and running again. So I think it'll be interesting to see kind of how slowly we start coming back. And I think that's where a lot of physicians are anxious. When can we get our practices back? When can we start helping our patients because they're struggling? And how will we do that? So not only when, but how? Will it be a slow, kind of steady progression? Do we only do young, healthy patients first because we don't have ICU capabilities? If we try to tackle some of the more complex patients, or can we? Will patients even want to have surgery in a hospital right now because they're scared? Maybe surgery centers are the best place to do surgery because you don't have COVID patients in a surgery center like you do in the hospital. What will the OR look like? Will the OR staff be coming back, and will they be comfortable doing these surgeries out of the gate? There's going to be a lot of competition between specialties for OR time, because is the OR time the OR going to be able to come back full bore, or is it going to be kind of in this stepwise fashion? And so is urology going to be competing with ENT, competing with orthopedics and neurosurgery, and who wins and who loses and who gets to be at the front of the line? The OR staff are going to struggle because they're going to have so much coming at them all at once. And how are they going to be able to bounce between specialties? And then now we're going to be taking call, and so many complex issues and dynamics. Right now in the world of orthopedics, the way we manage implants and instruments, they get shipped between hospitals almost every day. And so if you've got implants and instruments coming from a hospital full of COVID patients, what does that look like, right? And all that stuff, those boxes and all that is sitting right there in the OR where you've got patients, that are compromised. And then you have the logistics and sales model of people and personnel moving between hospitals that may be really having issues with COVID, that may be bringing the virus to a new hospital or a new facility. Because surgeons and nurses, we kind of stay in one particular place. We don't really move around, but there are a lot of people that do shift between facilities. And so we have to relook at that. So I think there's a lot of questions that are going to start popping up as we start thinking about how to move on and what healthcare looks like after this.
When do you expect to resume seeing patients or, doing procedures? Or is that still the question to be
Well, that's the million
answered?
dollar question, right? So if I could answer that, I'd probably be running the show right now. Um, but I think here's the other challenge: is will it be staged, based on geography of the country, right? The Pacific Northwest, Seattle is we think or hope on the starting to enter the downslope of this, versus New York maybe reaching the peak of this, and New Orleans maybe somewhere in the middle, and then we're starting to see the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, climbing up the upslope. And so, do we turn on some parts of the country and keep other parts of the country off? And then run the risk of reintroducing the virus in those places where we turn on. I don't know. It's very complicated. But I think the Pacific Northwest is kind of at the leading edge of this, and I think they're getting more and more confidence, gaining more and more confidence almost by the day. And so I'm very anxious to see how they model this out, because I think we will probably follow their lead, just like we did when this was first starting. We're learning a lot out of the Pacific Northwest, and that's what guided some of the decisions we were making here in New Orleans, and maybe even in New York and other places.
You had mentioned, getting ORs back up to speed and changes to logistics. What are some of the lessons that we're learning there? And how do you see in the future, maybe the surgeon medical device relationship changing or supply chain logistics changing based on what we've learned just in the last month?
Yeah, so I think, from what I can tell and from what I'm hearing, is pretty much everything is on the table. And we need to relook at supply chain, the last mile, if you will, of a lot of what we do, from a completely different lens, and a lens of resiliency. So, do we have the right redundancies and resiliencies in place? So, if one little piece of the system falls, the whole thing doesn't collapse like a house of cards. And right now, what I've noticed is there are a few key pieces of the system where we essentially put all our eggs in one basket. And if that basket has a hole in it, the whole system shuts down, right? So if you simply take the ventilator example right now, so it's not enough just to get a ventilator. You need the drugs to sedate the patient, right? To put on the ventilator. We've got filters that go inside the ventilator that you have to swap out and change. So there's a lot of supply chain issues just with ventilators, let alone all the other things. So if we look specifically at medical devices, you can see we're starting to see that a lot of companies are distressed right now. And so the model that we've deployed for decades is obviously not a resilient model, because we're seeing a lot of companies actually potentially going out of business. And so because we've got this kind of bloated, very costly, archaic device model, you're starting to see companies folding because it's not resilient, and it's too dependent on a high cost, high waste process. And so I think a lot of orthopedic companies, or device companies in general, are going to be re-looking at their sales, logistics, supply chain, to make sure they could weather a storm again like this.
Are there other challenges that you are trying to overcome with Site Medical?
Sure. So I think a lot of the challenges we had in healthcare before COVID are now amplified. And we've uncovered a lot of vulnerabilities that I think many of us knew existed, but necessarily didn't want to acknowledge or appreciate how important they were. So again, I think ranging from OR competency, and so how do we allow our OR staff to perform at the highest level possible? And so can we give them the tools and resources to be as successful as possible? So when a scrub tech or circulator moves between urology to ENT to orthopedics to neurosurgery, they can do it seamlessly. Because the concept of a dedicated team, a lot of surgeons want that. We want a dedicated team that knows everything I do by heart. They've memorized it. But the problem is that's not a resilient model, because if anyone on that team goes down or is unavailable, all of a sudden that process has holes in it, right? Now we're filling it in with people that don't necessarily know or appreciate what needs to get done. So can we leverage technology or create systems that enable the OR staff to perform at the highest level possible, no matter what surgery, what surgeon, whatever circumstance. I think, how do we scale best practices? So one of the interesting things is, you know, if we discover something very useful or efficient or something that should change during surgery, right? Maybe it's a new suture or new technique or new instrument or whatever. The adoption curve for that is like years, maybe 5 to 10 years for even something simple as a suture, right? But if we identify best practices, how do we scale that in real time? So we can drive quality and we can drive value across the entire healthcare system, right? So if you look at other industries, like let's take Tesla, for example, right? If they find a new way of doing something, they push that update out in their software, and the car now does something new across the entire world within a couple of weeks, right? So we can't do that in healthcare. If we find something new and useful that everyone should be doing, it takes 10 years. And then by then, it's already outdated, right? And so how do we move faster and with more agility, but also deliver the safety that we need, right? And be deliberate about it. You know, I think bringing value for all stakeholders is a challenge. So we've got a lot of waste and inefficiency in the system now. So right now, the communication within healthcare is horrible. So for example, if I do a joint replacement and I book that patient, let's say 3 months from now, right? Before COVID, I mean, I had patients scheduled in November for surgery, right? Because, you know, some patients, they want to schedule around the holidays and stuff like that. So the way the system works in the communication flow right now is no one in that ecosystem or stakeholder group finds out about that surgery until 2 days before it happens, even though I booked that case 3 months ago, right? It's loaded into Epic or the electronic medical record, but the vendor has no clue the surgery even exists until 2 days before. Now all of a sudden, 2 days before surgery, they're scrambling to bring in the instruments and the implants and the rep coverage and all of this stuff, which drives up costs, right, unnecessarily. And so all of a sudden now, instead of being able to plan 3 months ahead, as any industry would love to do, everyone's scrambling at the last minute because there's failure of communication. There's no flow of data to the appropriate people at the right time in the right format. And so, you know, there's so much low-hanging fruit here where we can drive value for every stakeholder and find a win across all stakeholders that doesn't necessarily have any losers. And all it is simply taking data and delivering it to the right people at the right time. It's as simple as that. And if you can do that, you can completely reinvent how we do business and make a more resilient system.
So what does this specifically mean, again, for the surgeon and or the hospital and the device company relationship? How do you see that changing from a supply chain logistics standpoint?
So I think the logistics model and the sales model, kind of last mile, if you will, is going to be automated, and there's going to be technology involved in this, because right now, if you look at that model, it hasn't changed in 40 years. So if you look at the way we do business right now, and I took a video or a picture guide of managing implants and instruments and all that kind of stuff, and I show that to you today compared to the same thing from 1970, it would look almost identical. So we've got to completely change that process, I think, if people expect to survive moving forward. There's going to be a tremendous amount of cost pressure, tremendous amount of pressure to drive efficiency and remove waste out of the system. So just like telemedicine has exploded in the last few weeks, I think there's going to be a much deeper appreciation of where technology can improve a lot of what we do in healthcare. So when you start introducing technology, it starts, you start to disintermediate a lot of the manual relationships and processes, right? Because it brings transparency to the process. It brings data to the process, and things start getting done in real time as opposed to this lag. So for example, if we introduce technology into the last mile, the sales, delivery, logistics model, we're not necessarily overnighting hundreds of pounds of stuff and driving costs up unnecessarily because we just found out about a surgery that we knew existed 3 months ago. If we introduce technology into this process, does it take 3 months for a vendor to get a purchase order or an invoice, even though we know that implant was used during surgery, right? Because right now that manual process is littered with errors. And I've heard stories where almost 25% of the invoice is incorrect. But from my perspective, how does that happen? Because I mean, I put in 4 implants. I don't understand how you can screw up 4 things, but apparently it does. And if you're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of surgeries being done a year, I imagine those things happen. So I think time to money, the delay, the inaccuracies, the inefficiencies, I think we can really improve on that. So that way, all the stakeholders can be as functional and as resilient as possible coming out of this. Just a little bit about Site Medical. So this is some technology we've developed with Ochsner Health System, which was our development partner here in Southern Louisiana. I think kind of one of the thought leaders, more progressive health systems in the United States. And they challenged us to figure out how do we redefine how the OR functions. And so we co-developed this technology with them to essentially digitize and datify surgery to drive value across all stakeholders. So where we find improvements in the OR, how do we pass that on to the vendors and to the OR staff and to the hospital? And so if we can get our hands around surgical processes and create more efficient, redundant, and resilient processes using technology, we can then create value for everyone, for all the stakeholders within the system. And that's effectively what Site Medical Technology has done, created value for just about every single stakeholder to allow them to have a more resilient model, no matter what the circumstances.
I appreciate you sharing that. Can you go in a little further about like what are the different components of your automating the system?
Sure. So what we do is we onboard a surgeon into our system. So we effectively ask them to turn this abstract concept, their surgical technique, into a digital technique guide that's then displayed in the operating room using voice control technology that the scrub tech uses. So that technology guides the OR staff on every aspect of that surgery, from simply how does the OR room get set up, if it's room 5 versus room 6, if it's a left knee versus a right knee, for example, where does the equipment go, how does Dr. Dasa set up the room, and then all the little details and nuances of how I do my surgery. It guides them through all those little specificities, all those little details that kind of make that surgery mine, if you will, and it guides them. And what we find is when we deploy this technology during surgery, it's completely changed the culture in the operating room. The OR staff feel empowered and autonomous, where they are now 3 or 4 steps ahead of me, where we're at a point now where I've got a scrub tech who's only 6 months out from school, performing at a level as if they had 10 or 15 years of experience, where I put my hand out and I get exactly what I need. I don't have to necessarily say a word anymore. And so the data that we're capturing during surgery now, we're able to guide the scrub techs and improve their performance because we can show them where they're struggling and where they're proficient. We can then take that data and look at the instruments and how the instruments are behaving. When we use these sets of instruments, the surgery takes 10% longer or 10% less time. We can then also project out, based on how the surgery goes, we can start predicting the quality and the cost of that surgery before the patient even leaves the OR by capturing all this intraoperative data. And then what happens is, because we've automated all of these surgical processes, the moment the implants get scanned out of our system, the PO actually gets created and the implants get delivered within 24, 48 hours of that surgery. And the vendor is actually starting to see their money within days rather than weeks and months. And so we've created this resilient process where from the moment I book the surgery until the inventory gets ordered, we've automated about 80 to 85% of that process. About 10 to 15% of that process is still manual, but about 80 to 85% of that process has been automated. So what that does then is it frees up the vendor's resources to go deliver the innovations they need to deliver to the market, right? It frees up their sales force to go out and engage surgeons and bring them the latest and greatest, as opposed to sitting at FedEx at 1 a.m. in the morning, hoping and praying that this random box is going to show up because they found out about something at the last minute. And so we create value for all the stakeholders, so there's a win-win across the board.
So you mentioned all of the data that you're capturing. What types of efficiencies have you seen so far from maybe a time, cost, et cetera?
Yeah, so what we've done is, because the OR staff, for example, can stay 3 or 4 steps ahead of me, because they have complete control over my surgical process and the pace of the surgery, we've actually shaved about 15%, 20% of time off of each one of my knee replacements. And arguably, the knee replacement, from an instrument and technical perspective, is probably one of the more challenging cases for the OR staff to cover. What we've also found at Ochsner Health System, who's been such a tremendous partner in developing this technology, is we've reduced the waste, or the amount of med-surg supplies that are used during surgery, and the billable medical supplies. And so, because the OR staff have this technology that's guiding them through every aspect of the surgery, we found less than, believe it or not, Dr. Millett, one of our surgeons that helped develop the technology, less than $10 of variation over 3 years in his med-surg costs. In those cases where we use the technology versus in the cases that didn't. In the cases that didn't, up to $200, $250 in variation in med-surg alone, let alone billable medical supplies and some of the other things. So just the cost savings there by standardizing how the OR staff simply open the case and manage the surgery. Tremendous amount of opportunities there, let alone efficiencies and throughput and quality and all kinds of other things.
So then what are the next steps for Site Medical to expand?
So I think right now we're working diligently with a lot of vendors to bring their implants into our system, so that way they can scale, and their reps, instead of managing 2 or 3 busy total joint surgeons, can now manage 10 or 15 surgeons remotely, so they can be strategic in terms of how they spend their time. So bringing new vendors and implants into the system, I think it's working with hospitals and surgeons that now, again, in the post-COVID era, are going to realize that we need to start deploying technologies and solutions kind of for the new paradigm, where we need to automate and create more resiliency in a lot of the workflows that we have.
Great. Anything else that you would like to share about Site Medical?
No, that's kind of Site Medical in a nutshell.
Sounds good. Well, I wish you the best of luck with continuing the expansion of that, and thank you for your time today.
All right, take care.